I'd been given the script to read, and I was asked what I thought about the character, how I saw it, how I, think it ought to be played. And having just come out of drama school, I was very much into method acting and all the rest of it, and had done a big sort of think about the part. And so I told them what I thought, and I went on for quite a bit about the character as I saw it and everything like that. And I do remember Terry Fisher turning to the producer and saying, I don't know whether we thought of all that, but Terry was very famous in Hammer circles and things like that. He'd done a lot of films. And it's my first film. He knew that. And he took care of me. As I say, he'd whisper at me and say, that facial reaction's probably a little bit too big. Can you tone it down a bit? Just technical things like that. I mean, not necessary to do with the part, because I think after my initial interview with him, I think he knew what I wanted to do with the part and left me to it. But it was, I suppose, film technique that he made me aware of and helped me with. And he was a very kind man. But he had a good eye and knew what he wanted. And if you wanted to do another take, he would let you if you didn't think you did it well enough or you could have done it better, provided you didn't go to take 10. But he was a joy to work with.
Hello.
Are you hurt?
Oh, only my pride. I lost my temper.
I know.
Susan Denberg, yes. I mean, she was a very beautiful girl, and she was great. She was lovely, and we were supposed to fall in love in this film, and she had a rather nasty scar on her face and a sort of a limp and something wrong with her arm. It was a surprise to me on sort of day one with our first scene, where I first met Susan, to actually see what she was going to look like. I knew she was supposed to have had a scar on her face and that, but one didn't know what. We had a big laugh about it to begin with, and all that. But nevertheless, there was this bedroom scene, and I'd never done a bedroom scene before in my life, and so one was a bit sort of scared of it, really. But Susan was, nope, right, let's get naked and all the rest of it. And so we actually did have something on our lower half, but although she was quite prepared not to. And in those days, nudity, and particularly in Hammer, was, it wasn't quite as free as it is today, shall I say. And I do remember we were lying on the bed, and we placed in position, and I remember my left arm was placed very carefully over Susan's right breast, covering her nipple, and I was given strict instructions whilst doing the scene not to move my arm and expose the breast. So one was doing this scene rather like this, absolutely terrified of moving, which was a bit restrictive, really. But I thought that was rather amusing.
Stop that, you young fool! You'll smash the place up!
The fight scene, yeah. Well, it was a little one-sided. I felt I was fighting 3 others at the time, and I was protecting the honour of Susan, who was being mocked by these 3 ne'er-do-wells, rich ne'er-do-wells. But, that was a good day's work, really. I don't think we did that many takes on it, so it went quite well. But it does look a little undercranked, I think. But they speeded it up a bit. I think there was even in the end a knife involved, and one of them got cut. But It was. We were using all sorts of things, and as I say, they were specially made furniture that one could throw at each other or hit each other with, and it was carefully worked out. We had a fight director, and we worked out, and somehow I managed to stay alive, even though I was fighting three of them. But ended up by being arrested, really, because I mean they were sort of had money. They were dandies, the local dandies, and were able to convince the police that I was the one at fault, really. And I followed in my father's footsteps on the storyline, and ended up on the guillotine and had my head chopped off. Which, I mean, you have to think about that sort of thing really when you're filming it. And you see this guillotine there with this real blade up there, and the director wants you to put your neck there, and then the other bit goes on top of your neck, and the blade is still up there, and they assure you that the blade is firmly fixed and won't fall. But it takes, a bit of faith to do it. But one did it, and it was okay. But it was, I was a little apprehensive about doing that, because once I was in it, I was locked in it, and that was it. If anything did go wrong, they wouldn't have needed another head at all, really. But the head was made especially. And I went for, I think, about 3 sessions with an artist, and he moulded it in clay, and I thought did a remarkable job. I almost wanted to take it home with me when we'd finished with it, but I never actually managed to get that. But and then they sort of stuck it on a mirror, I think, in the film. Yes, they stuck it on a mirror, and there was a rather funny moment where it actually speaks too, on top of the mirror, which I think brought the house down a bit occasionally.
I have done what you told me. What am I to do now?
You will kill Johann. Kill him. Kill him. Kill him.
There were never any sort of hiatus in the film, really, as far as I can remember. It all went rather smoothly. I do remember that, again, this is sort of Hammer, the way they sort of operate, because they were quite happy with what I'd done on the film. There was a scene where Peter Cushing and Thorley Walters are extracting the soul from my body after its head had been cut off, and I'd finished filming then. I'd finished the filming, but they then asked me to come back and said, "Would you like, another couple of days filming?" Which, being paid for it is all very nice. And what they didn't want to do was to make a copy of my body without the head that they could film, because they wanted to do all this with their special effects, extracting the thing. So I went back on 2 extra days and lay on a slab, and there'd been a hole cut in the top of the slab, and I placed my head down the hole so that it looked as though I didn't have a head, and they'd covered it up. And I lay there for 2 days, really, with my head down in the hole, which meant that they didn't have to make a body double in order to do that. And so I got 2 extra days' pay, which was rather nice then. Yeah. And again, you see, it's making these things work in those days. They had all sorts of buzzing light things going on, and it actually worked. there was this light coming from the body and all that. How they managed it, I don't really know. But Peter Cushing always looked very, very earnest, though. I mean, he was a lovely man to work with as well. I mean, they all were. They all were. You had to watch Thorley a bit, though, mind you, because if Thorley was in the background behind you doing something, he'd always be moving or something, the audience could see him. But Peter was, again, lovely and took it all very, very seriously. But it was one of the happiest jobs I'd ever done, really, because everybody was, working together in a good, positive way.
This was the very first films that I was asked to do were 3 Hammer films shot back to back at Bray Studios. I think there was probably like a 2-week or 3-week gap in between each film. And in those days, filming was very different. The hours were 8:30 till 5:30. And if the producer wanted to go over 5:30, they could go a quarter, which was 15 minutes. So they had an expression, they'd call the quarter, but that was to only to finish that specific shot. So if it was at 5:30, they'd say, call the quarter, and then they would go to 5:45 just to finish that particular shot. And if they wanted to do overtime to finish on a set or something, and they wanted to go to 6:30, then they had what they could call the hour, but you needed notice. So you had to ask the day before and say to the crew, look, we need to work an hour's overtime tomorrow evening. Or if they wanted to work till 7:30, that means they had to lay on a supper break for the crew, because the unions were much stronger in those days, and so it was much easier. Unlike nowadays, you go to work. I've been worked 22 hours non-stop, and followed by an 18-hour day. So it's ridiculous now what people go through, and it is, it's dangerous. You can't function properly. But in those days, it was sensible. And they even had a thing like travellers away was another expression. So if it was foggy out, the people that travelled, these are the people that were the studio employees, not to us who were freelancers, but the studio employees. If they travelled to work and they lived far away, at 4:00 someone from the union would come round onto the set and say, "Travellers away." So they could go home at 4:00 while we had to wait till 5:30 if it was foggy or bad weather or something. So it was quite extraordinary, the protocols in those days, and the style of shooting, and because the equipment was so unwieldy as well. So everything was a lot harder and a lot slower, but they never shot cover. When you did a scene, and you did maybe the scene and a couple of close-ups. Well, nowadays they do the scene, they do close-ups, over shoulders. It's covered from every which way, and they, do it in the cutting rooms. Whereas in those days, it was you didn't do so many shots, because obviously the lighting took much longer as well. Because, you maybe get a setup and you might take an hour to light the set because they're all up there, lamps everywhere. Because it was a much different approach, totally different approach to the way you'd approach photography now. So everything took a bit longer, so the shots lasted longer takes, and less number of shots. And Bray Studios was, I think it was owned by Hammer, were they? I think they were owned by Hammer, yeah. And it was lovely setting by the river there, it was nice.
Yes, there were no locations involved, or very few. I often said to Tony Nelson Keys, who was the executive producer, I said, why don't we go overseas or go to Austria? No, we can't afford it. Haven't got the money. Can't afford it. So we didn't go. We shot it all in the Bray area, using library material. The
sets are all very familiar, and I think that's what they did. Most of those sets are revamped. Pack strike, I think, is the phrase they use. Pack strike, yeah. So basically, they strike the set, they take it down, but they keep it in a warehouse somewhere, in a storeroom somewhere, and they'd bring them back out again, put them back up again, paint them a slightly different colour, change something, and that would be your set. So all those sets were revamped and used on subsequent films, because obviously it was expensive to throw them away.
They all competed with each other. They were all good box office, and we made them all in 6 to 8 weeks.
I think most of our locations were very local, so they didn't have to pay too far, because they were also very low budget.
Frankenstein Created Woman, with Susan Denberg and Peter Cushing. Terence Fisher was the director. He got quite a name for himself. He had a knack of dealing with horror films, and I never saw him doing the outside of Hammer, but he must have done things because he certainly knew what he was doing.
As a clapper loader, you don't really say more than hello, good morning, sir, or something, because it's only when you become a focus puller or an operator or a cameraman you're actually dealing with them, directing, because you want to, you've got to measure them, you've got to get them in the shot, you've asked them to move a bit to the right, a bit to the left, and turn this way, turn that way. Whereas a clapper loader, you just put the clapper board in and your job's done, and you load the film and get the tea. So you're not really working, you don't get that much close contact with the actors, only sometimes, occasionally, if you're off camera, and they might be standing by the camera for off-screen lines, and then you might chat to them then, but that was on rare occasions. The cinematographer was a chap called Arthur Grant, and his operator was Moray Grant, although they were no relation. It was a very harmonious working relationship, between, he'd known Arthur many years, I think, and he'd known Moray, and it was always a very, very friendly working relationship. And, everybody, very professional, everybody knew what they were doing. I mean, the shots weren't too taxing, like these days when you go and see shots and you see these shots start off and they go off down there. Well, the equipment didn't lend itself to that, so it was very straightforward style of shooting. So it was a much more, dare I say, a conservative approach. It was like the camera's here, it's a two-shot and waste. And so it was all very a gentleman's approach. And the working relationships were always very friendly, And the cinematographers were given time to light, They realised that it does take time to light a set. So it was always given, I don't know, if it was you walk onto a new set, you might have an hour and a half to light the shot or whatever, but that was always put into the schedule, whereas nowadays it's all about, right, this is a shot, how long are you going to be? Can we shoot in 15 minutes, because that's the nature of the beast now, whereas in those days it was far more leisurely approach, and as long as you filmed your 2.5 day pages a day or whatever the budget was, everyone was happy. And Arthur was very nice, very quietly spoken man, very good, and loved his filters. He would always play around when day for night photography. I know he used to use an 81EF and a CC20G or a 10cc CTG, which was a slightly green filter. So the 81EF was slightly blue, and he'd add a little bit of green. So you'd have to cut these filters to insert into the camera, and they were plastic gelatine filters, so they were quite fiddly to deal with, and you'd have to put two together, and you had to be careful they didn't bloom and stuff like this, and they had to be inserted in the camera. But Arthur was very much a filter man, and because in those days you were always using lots of filters, because if you were shooting outside, the film stock required you to have an 85 filter, or if it got too big, you'd have an 85C or a 85B and 85C, even an 85A. So you had a box like this, all of different filters already made up that you could slip in and out of the camera, because as the light changed during the day, so the filters would always change. So you were constantly doing that. Or changing film stocks, if you were a clap-up loader, you were always saying, change stock, so you had to go and you only had a limited number of film magazines, usually 4, and you had to keep 2 stocks on the go in case the light changed. You had to keep changing stock. But Arthur was a very nice man. He was very quietly spoken. I'm not sure he didn't. I think he was probably where he was from, actually, what his origins were. But he had a bit of an accent, whether it was Welsh or somewhere like that, I'm not sure. But he was nice, and I think Moray was Scottish. Sounds like a bit named Moray Grant, but they both used to smoke. Probably Moray more than Arthur, but smoking all the time. Because in those days, everybody smoked, and you'd put your cigarette out on the studio floor. Now, of course, it's much cleaner. You can't smoke at all now. But in those days, everybody smoked. But both nice, very nice to work with. And, as a clapper boy, part of your role is you've got to get the tea for the camera crew. And when you're in the studio in those days, you had to buy your tea and your cheese rolls or whatever you wanted. And at 10 o'clock, the trolley would come onto the stage. You'd start filming at 8:30, you start work, and at 10 o'clock was tea. You didn't break, you just carried on working, but my job was to go and get the tea. Well, I would go to the tea trolley, buy the tea for the camera crew, get their cheese rolls or their bacon rolls or whatever they wanted, and give them back to them. And then I had to keep a tally, because at the end of the week they owed me money, and it was probably, I don't know, 3p for a cup of tea and a shilling for a bacon roll or whatever it was, and I had to keep a tally, and at the end of the week I'd say, Arthur, you owe me 16 and 3p, and Moray, you owe me... Well, Moray was always more, because he always liked lots of cups of tea. In fact, worse than that, I had to have a kettle in the camera room, which was close to the stage, with an electric kettle, because I had to make tea all day long. Yeah, I had fond memories, It was my introduction into films, which was before that I'd been on television commercials, but films is much more of a discipline too. You've got to be a much faster, keener, working and be more efficient. Whereas television commercials, they might take all morning to do one shot. Well, on a film, you've done 5 or 6 shots by then, so you've got to be more efficient.